So, welcome to Taxonomy inside and outside of Drupal. If that's not what you thought you were going to see, this would be a good time to go figure out where you meant to be. So I am Rob Huffstedtler, reachable on Twitter, at rhuffstedtler, my D.O username, rhuffstedtler. Pretty much anywhere where you might find some person, rhuffstedtler is a good thing to try for me. I never have any difficulty registering it. And since we're talking about taxonomy, I thought it would be good to talk about some of the ways in which I am classified. So as you might have imagined, Linnaeus would classify me as a Homo sapiens, probably fairly obvious from looking at me. Occupation, it's our internal designation. I'm a technical director, which means nothing to most people outside of our organization. But what it means is that I get to spend a fair amount of time with my hands on the code, but I also get to spend a lot of time in these sort of cross-functional settings where I'm collaborating with my peers on the content strategy side, or the testing side, visual design, and some of those things they actually let me play around in a little bit myself when we have a need that can be contained. And that's kind of how I got into doing some taxonomy stuff. We have guys who do this full-time, but we also have some projects where you need a little bit of taxonomy work, and when you need that, it's good to be able to switch hit a little bit. My Myers-Briggs type, I'm an INFP, although I've been told that anybody who would call themselves an I would never put that on a slide. The bottom things all come from the Scotland census. I'm not Scottish, but I was looking for good examples of categorizations, and these are some of theirs. So, my spoken English, very well. I would have said they should have used very good as a term there rather than well, but whatever. My Gaelic skills, non-existent. And distance travel to work, also a fun one. I actually basically work out of our Minneapolis office, but I actually live in Raleigh, and I did not see our Minneapolis office until 2 days ago for the first time, so that was kind of fun. Mostly I work or study at home, and my general health is very good. So taxonomy. This is DrupalCon, or DrupalCamp rather. So probably a lot of you think of taxonomy in terms of this item on the structure menu. This is not where you want to start. I'm overselling that point a little bit because if you've got a really simple use case where you want something like a list of colors, you've got 10 items in it, and the only reason you're making it a taxonomy is so your authors can manage it, sure, come in and configure it. But if you're doing anything that's more complex, there's a whole process to get to how you have a taxonomy that's going to work for your users and your set of digital interactions. So this is sort of 101 level material here. Almost any of these slides I could talk about for a long time. My colleagues will tell you I could talk about anything for a long time, whether it's interesting or not. But being 101 level material, there's going to be a lot of oversimplifications and generalizations here. So anything I say at this point could be nuanced a lot more, and I'll be glad to talk to you all weekend long about all the nuances of it. Consult your own taxonomist before making any categorizations. So what is a taxonomy? Sort of by, let's go with a numerical way of doing this. 4 fingers if you feel like you are deep with taxonomy, 1 finger if you barely know what a taxonomy is, 2 or 3 if you're in the middle. Okay, seeing lots of 1s and 2s here, so good. Hopefully that won't bore. I won't bore anybody with this. A taxonomy, I'm giving this definition specifically in the context of digital experience management. A taxonomy is a classification of content into a structure with 1 or more facets, also known as attributes, or in the Drupal specific world, vocabularies. And each facet may be arranged in a hierarchy. Sometimes they're flat, sometimes they're not. And it may offer a controlled set of terms to choose from. You can also have them wide open. So, by example, I give a lot of sort of e-commerce-y examples because I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that everybody in here has at least once in their life purchased something from Amazon or wherever. So you've probably done things like this before. So let's say you're going to buy a shirt, right? There's all kinds of ways you might try and find the shirt you want. You go to your site that's going to sell it, and you start clarifying down to, do I want men's clothing, women's clothing, adult clothing, kids clothing, whatever. But even below that, you're going to get to things like color, size, material. This example I actually stole right from Kohl's website. And one of the things I found interesting here was they also came up with this facet of occasion. Like, there are things that certain shirts are appropriate for and things that other shirts are not appropriate for. I can imagine what a Christmas shirt might be. I have no clue what a bridal shirt would be. There are also industry standard classifications that you've probably worked with in some circumstances in your life. Obvious one there being Library of Congress subject headings. If you've been to college in the last 20, 30, 40 years, and you've done a research paper, there's a good chance you've had to deal with that particular classification system. But there are others. MESH is a set of subject headings for medical stuff specifically. Covers anatomy, covers physiology, covers procedures, covers diagnoses, covers a whole bunch of things. If you were to work on a site like WebMD, that might or might not be a useful way of classifying things. NAICS actually used that on a project that was using it for classifying users more so than content, not users, visitors. It is a hierarchical structure of every industry that they've identified. So, within logistics, you might have trucking, and you might have sea shipping, and so on. XBRLs for financial reporting, and so on. Point being that in many cases, there are standard taxonomies that you can just sort of pull from, and probably each of you has some familiarity with one that sort of fits your particular life. Okay, I've got a taxonomy. I kind of know what one is now. What are things I could do with a taxonomy? Well, let me back up a little bit. Because one of the things I like to point out is that as modern computer science-y kinds of people, we tend to get a little full of ourselves. And we imagine that we are inventing the future, which we are. I mean, it's cool. But the future often started a long time ago. And some of the things that we think are absolutely brand new have had a serious amount of thought put into them in other contexts that we then can take and apply to our context. Anything taxonomy related, and any of the specific use cases I'm going to talk about in a minute, you can take some of the thought process from S.R. Ranganathan and apply it. This fellow, he was an Indian guy, and he was known as the father of library science. He came up with these 5 laws of library science. The first one is that books are for use. In the context of library science, what he was trying to get people to understand was libraries are not primarily places of preservation and curation, that the real function of a library is to connect the knowledge that's contained in a book to somebody who needs to use it. Secondly, every reader has his or her book. Every person who comes into the library, there's something he or she is looking for. Number 3, every book has its reader. So every time an author has gone through the effort to write something and encode that knowledge, he's doing that for the benefit of a particular audience. And we want to be able to connect those together. Number 4, save the time of the reader. The value of a library and of the knowledge contained in it is when you're interacting with the reading material, not all the stuff that goes on to get you to the material you want. Does any of this sound like conversations you might have had at work about digital stuff in the last little bit? Number 5, the library is a growing organism. We've got new materials coming in every day, and those materials are going to be about new and different things. Think about just computer books written in the last few years. If we were talking about this in the 1980s, I'd be using examples of like the C++ standard templating library and HyperCard and stuff like that. Talking about now, we're going to use examples like Mongo and Node and things of that nature. Drupal, of course. But I thought these needed a little bit of updating and transformation to apply to our particular circumstances. So another great thinker, me, last week, came up with my 6 laws of digital experience management. feel free to quote them or not. And this is basically a little bit of find and replace, and you get exactly what we're talking about. Content is for use. We don't write content just to write content. We're trying to either persuade someone, entertain them, inform them, whatever we're trying to accomplish there. But the visitors, the people we interact with, and this was actually kind of a hard one. Content was obvious. For the second one, I was like, what do I want to call this? Do I want to call it a visitor? I didn't really like visitor because that locks you into sort of the traditional web paradigm. I'm sitting there at a browser, I'm going to a website, and I'm driving the interaction. But there's other ways of interacting in digital experiences, right? I could be interacting through a mobile app. I could be interacting through a voice-guided interface. I could be interacting through a kiosk that's all pulling the same kinds of information. So I was like, okay, I'll call it the user. Well, I don't like calling anybody a user because it's not specific enough. But in this case, I decided it was still too specific because to call the person a user sort of implies that they are initiating the interaction. And as you may have read about in Dries' blog post, The Coming Reverse of the Web, we're at the threshold of a point in time where it will not be unusual for the interaction to start from the point of view of the service. I, as the service provider, have encoded data that tells me about your interests, and now when some event happens, I can reach out to you instead of you reaching out to me. So a great example of this would be airports, right? What's the one thing we all care the most about when we're about to leave town? Chris?
Flight on time.
Okay, that's like, we care about that one. The one I care about even more, because I fly out of Atlanta a lot, how long is that dadgum security line? So I want them to tell me if that line is getting any longer than normal so that I can know, okay, I got to get out of here now. So I think we need to think about it just in terms of people. People interacting with people, people interacting with services, services interacting with people. Every content is person, same idea. Number 4 is a new one I added that didn't really apply in Ranganathan's time because the library was open during regular business hours. That was your time. Now, when we start having these interactions, we need to think about what time it is, not just in the sense of what does that clock say. That's important. I don't care how important your information is, unless somebody's dying, don't wake me up at 3 in the morning. But it also matters context in our life. Great example of the wrong thing to do. If you buy a vacuum cleaner on Amazon, there's a good chance that a few days later they're going to send you another email because they think, this guy likes vacuum cleaners. I should tell him about the other highly rated vacuum cleaners. It's useless. What might be useful is if you knew the model of vacuum cleaner I bought, and 3 months later you sent me a reminder that said, hey, it's time for you to clean or change your filter in your vacuum, and by the way, here's the instructions for doing that. Because I guarantee you, 3 months from now, I have no idea what the manual for that vacuum was. And of course, our content is a growing organism for all the same reasons we talked about with books. So, specific use cases. I did talk a little bit conceptually about getting out of the typical browser experience, but for now, I'm going to guess the world that most of us in this room live in is primarily building websites and kiosk interfaces. Am I largely on track with that? Okay. So, 3 kinds of things that taxonomy enables there. First is browsing. These first 2 examples here are from eBay. You may want to browse a category listing. And again, e-commerce is a great example for that because people are used to a hierarchy of, yeah, I kind of know this thing is an automotive part, and I know it's, transmission or something, as opposed to it's clothing. So people can very quickly narrow down the spectrum of things they need to search. Back to that rule of let's save the person's time. Faceted search, of course, you've all played with that. Once you've done a search for something, you may get back millions of results. And you need to start throwing out the things that are not a fit. So if we expose specific facets with controlled vocabularies that are meaningful to the user, he or she can start refining it and get down to a manageable set of things that then they can look at and make the decision they want to make. And then the last one, content tailoring. You sometimes hear this referred to as content targeting. And it finally hit me this morning as I was driving over here. I changed my slide because I've always hated calling it targeting. I am a completely unashamed capitalist. And the reason capitalism works, or when capitalism works, is when we see ourselves as free individuals freely interchanging with each other to create value. Capitalism stops working when we see the people with whom we're interacting as nothing more than sources of money. And to me, I think that targeting notion, it dehumanizes it, and we're trying to humanize here. One of our mottos at Olson is think like people. I know I don't want to be targeted, so let's lose target. Tailor. I'm finding the things that matter to you. So sort of the canonical example of this is, again, e-commerce. If it is April and you come to my site and you live in New Brunswick, chances are you are not looking for board shorts. But if you're coming to my site in April from Miami, you probably don't want a parka. Another fun fact. Here's one of these places where we think that within the last 10 years we've like discovered fire, right? We can totally personalize things to the user. Well, yeah, we can, but not new. Printed magazines have had this idea for, ever since they started publishing different editions in different regions of the country. They were able to put advertisements in there that made sense for the readership in that locale. The difference is that with the computing power we have now, we can get down to the individual level. And with the data we have about people and the data we have about our content, we can start putting all that stuff together to drive really meaningful experiences. Oh, another fun fact, the other reason I don't like targeting does tend to have a purely commercial sort of connotation for a lot of people. And we're not just doing commerce with this. One of the more interesting things, interesting applications of this I've seen is a site that Chris and I do some maintenance on. It's a volunteer opportunity site. So they've classified thousands of volunteer opportunities, and they allow their users to classify themselves according to skills and interests. So every time you visit their site, if you're logged in, they'll show you 20 relevant volunteer opportunities that you might be interested in. Okay, great. How do we do this? So this slide is normally my intro slide, like if I'm doing a kickoff for clients of ours that we're going to do a taxonomy project on. And it has a lot of detailed slides that follow it that typically take me between an hour and a half to go through. We're not going to do that today. We're going to give the high-level overview of this. And I'm even going to simplify the language. I'm realizing that yellow one's probably not very readable back there in the back, is it? That's okay? Okay, good. So first thing, content sampling and analysis. In simple human terms, we need to figure out what's the content we have, and then we need to look at some amount of it, right? Hopefully some of you went to Lynn and Carrie's presentation this morning. It was really great. This whole thing, this whole process does not exist off by itself. It typically is happening in the context of other content strategy work and other user research. So before I start this, I really like to know, at a minimum, my user roles, but preferably I like to have actual personas, because even people who are in the same role may choose to interact with our experience in very different manners. And having a persona that tells me how they want to interact can inform how I'm going to classify my content. Analysis, we'll talk a little bit about how much you need to look at, but really this is basically taking notes. Up here on the second row, actually first and second row, we have two gentlemen who have yellow legal pads and pens. That is a great tool for doing this first round of analysis. You go through it, you make some notes, you start to figure out what would be the different ways I could describe this content that might align to the scenarios we've identified in our user flows, so that I can tell, okay, being able to classify it this way is going to help this person search for it, it's going to help me connect it to them without them taking an action, whatever it might be. I sometimes do it in a spreadsheet instead, but I find it a little bit quicker on the notepad. Once we've got this sort of hypothetical initial swag at things, then we can have some work sessions. some of the vocabulary is not going to be clear to you, especially if you are working with a client who's in a very specialized industry. There may be all kinds of words on their content that you're like, I'm not really sure I know what that means. And a good question to start pondering then is, if you don't understand it, does their readership understand the term? We draft a taxonomy. Who here has ever done card sorts typically for navigational stuff, right? Okay, 3 or 4 people. Card sorts are a great thing to use in taxonomy. I'll show you a slide in a minute and we'll talk a little bit more in depth there. Once we've got our draft taxonomy, then we can start to review it. So we go to our stakeholders and we say, here's what we have. Typically the way we do that at that point is in a spreadsheet. I like to do 1 worksheet per vocabulary, and I like to sort of represent the hierarchy by going as many columns across as I need to. In most cases, you don't need to get more than about 3 levels deep. If you're getting 3 levels deep, you're getting into a very specialized taxonomy that you're going to have to train people how to use, and that's often problematic. Then you want to do some test tagging. So can I print out a bunch of sheets of paper with representative content and give people my draft taxonomy and say, classify this stuff? And if I have 3 or 4 people classify the same sets of things, and then I look at it, are they classifying it the same way? Because if your test group can't classify it the same way, once you hand it over to ordinary authors, you have no chance of getting consistent tagging, at which point it becomes useless. We're going to revise it to deal with any problems that we uncovered there, and then we're ready to roll it out. So we start educating our authors. We show them what these vocabularies mean. We explain them in the context of how they're being used, because it can be every field you add. I'm sure you've all seen this from a site building perspective. Every field you add to a content type, if it is not required, unless there's a really good reason for that field, people will leave it blank and move on. And especially if it's something that is not directly displayed on the page. So then you end up with unclassified content that becomes fairly unfindable in a large content pool. I've applied this process on sites up to, we have one, it's not a Drupal site, but they have 300,000 unique page URLs. That's largely because of translation. Under the hood it's a few thousand, but then it gets translated multiple times. Another question that may be occurring to some of you, how long does this take? We typically will budget 4 to 6 weeks, usually person and a half for this on a fairly substantial site with a few thousand to tens of thousands of pieces of content. You can do it faster if it's a smaller set of content and if your stakeholders know their content really well. What are some challenges we might encounter? So first, how much do I need to look at? And this is actually really depressing to me because I kind of like concrete answers. If we had this library here, we would have to read all these books to come up with the Library of Congress subject headings. Actually, it would be really interesting to know how many pieces they looked at to come up with it. It really is more art than science. I've talked to social science researchers about this. I've talked to people with PhDs in statistics. And the answer I get pretty much comes down to you need to look at enough. And at a practical level, it's the same thing that I've heard from social science researchers. When you're continuing to look at things and you're not generating any new insights, once the new data becomes boring to you, you've probably kind of hit your saturation point. Of course, I'm always looking at it from the perspective of, well, what if I'm just really dense and I'm not seeing the nuances? But general rules, more is better. The smaller your corpus is, the bigger your percentage of your sample needs to be. And how complete you need to be is a function of the consequences of being wrong. Now, if it's just a small reduction in findability, that's fine. If a misclassification, on the other hand, in one of these scenarios like medical subject headings could lead to ultimately providing people wrong medical information, you might want to be a little bit more precise. Another problem, classification depends on user. Here we have 3 common plumbing parts. Does everybody recognize these and know the names? A few people? Okay. Well, here's what plumbers call them. The first, of course, is a supply line. The second is a pop-up assembly. The one on the right is a P-trap. That is capital letter P for those who are not seeing the slides. Here's what my teenagers call these. So that would be a hose thingy, a drain thingy, and another drain thingy. Why this is actually relevant is when you're dealing with your stakeholders inside a business or any other organization, those folks have gotten really used to the way they talk about things. And it doesn't occur to them how weird it is. I mean, we're Drupalers here, right? There's a bunch of stuff that we say that you talk to anybody else in the world of web content management, and they're like, I have no clue what is a hook, right? So you have to find ways of talking about it that are relevant to the audience that you're going to be speaking of. Focus groups are speaking to. Focus groups can be a real help with that. Secondly, classification depends on use case. So here I have 3 of the same thing. What's this first thing? Fish. It's a fish. Exactly. I think that's fairly obvious. It's a guppy. Probably the first thing that you would think of if I said fish. You'd either come up with something like that or maybe a bass or something. This being Minnesota, I guess you'd come up with a walleye. So if I'm running a pet store and I'm classifying things as fish, that's probably what I'm talking about. However, let's say I'm a 17th century Flemish painter and I'm trying to depict the story of the biblical prophet Jonah, where it talks about the great fish. Well, then I probably end up with something a little bit more like that. For those of you who really like to nerd out, be like me, there is a paper titled When Whales Became Mammals by a fellow named Aldemaro Romero, wherein he covers the entire history of the classification of whales, all the way from Aristotle up to Linnaeus, and it's a fascinating read. I'm sure the next presenter will not be sad if you skip their session to go find this paper and read it. It's that good. Now, on the other hand, let's say I'm an 18th century Spanish missionary serving in Venezuela. I have a lot of people converting to Catholicism. Lent is coming up. These people love to eat them some capybara. So I got to figure out, what am I going to do about this? Can these guys eat this? So I send a letter to the Vatican. I say, it spends most of its time in the water. So it turns out, from a culinary perspective, it's a fish. I swear I did not make this up. Another fun side note, I think it was Mark Drummond made me aware of a site last night. It's a Tumblr site called Animals Sitting on Capybaras. So go check that out. That one's a freebie. How do I organize my vocabulary? So if I've gotten past flat lists and I'm into hierarchical lists, card sorts become really useful for this. Let me give you a practical example of one we had. We had a client and they insisted that they have 2 different vocabularies. One, they were a retailer of home improvement products. They insisted that they have separate vocabularies for classifying indoor spaces and outdoor spaces. So given that, living room, indoor or outdoor? Okay, good. Patio, indoor or outdoor? Garage. Yeah. But we have one confident person here. It turned out that when we put it to users in a card sort, it was like 53% indoor, 47% outdoor. I tried to make the case to them at that point that this was a really good indication that their actual audience didn't care whether it was indoor or outdoor. That was not relevant to them. But I lost that argument. So it can also help you figure out things like, is an open or a closed taxonomy a better choice? Open means the user can add their own terms. And this applies in a card sort as well. If in the card sort you have users asking for blank cards, it occurs to me a lot of people said they had not done card sorts. The way a card sort works, so you can do it either online or in person. If you go online, Optimal Sort's a great tool, fairly inexpensive. Both of these examples are actually from doing navigational card sorts. So if you're trying to determine the best way to organize your site's navigation, your menu tree, this can be a great way to do that. But the exact same set of principles apply, and the methodology is exactly the same. So if you're doing it in person, you get a few people, and you don't have to do them at the same time. It works a little bit. There are people who argue about this, whether it's better to let people work collaboratively or to let people work individually. You write out your subject headings, you write out your vocabulary terms that you have on index cards, and you hand them to the people, and you say, okay, go ahead and organize these. And if it's an open card sort, you'll also give them blank cards, so if they feel like they need to add additional cards to come up with the categorization they want, they can do that. The other reason that I tend to prefer in person, if you can do it, is you get to hear the thought process. If somebody's talking about where they want to stick a card, it helps you understand why they think a garage is an indoor space or an outdoor space. But it can be hard to recruit the people. Online allows you to recruit people from anywhere. It allows them to do it at their own pace, and it becomes a little bit easier to report the data as well. So, book recommendations. I don't think I can talk about anything without giving a book recommendation. The first one is Everything is Miscellaneous, The Power of the New Digital Disorder. And Weinberger makes the case that a lot of our classifications are a little bit arbitrary. It sort of is illustrated by my fish slide. And that what really matters is it's how your user classifies things. At sort of a fundamental level, I disagree with him. I think that he very much follows in the footsteps of Aristotle and is hardcore about how disconnected things are. I won't get into the philosophy of why that makes language completely meaningless if you totally buy into that. But at a tactical level, just go with what he said. Like, it's part of the all models are wrong, but some models are useful sort of thing. Second book, this one is more the how do I actually do stuff book, which is probably what more of you care about. The Accidental Taxonomist. And I was going to recommend this book anyway, even though the first edition is like 9 years old at this point, and half of the tools that she recommends are no longer available. The communities that she recommends for interacting with other people doing taxonomy work have all changed. But the core of the book was so good, I was still going to recommend it. And I would go to find an image, and it says second edition on it. I'm like, wow, when did that come out? A month ago. So get it. It's awesome. I haven't read the second edition yet, so I may be, if the second edition is as awesome as the first edition, it's awesome. Speaking of things that are awesome, taxonomies are awesome in Drupal. Why? Why is Drupal such a great taxonomy tool? I actually meant to have that not as my first slide. I've got to jump forward one. Or two. Actually, I know how I moved that to the last one. So the most important thing to me is that in Drupal, taxonomy is a site builder task. It's not a developer task. And that puts it a little bit closer to the people who want to be doing it. It also makes it a lot less expensive to do and a lot less expensive to continue revising. So you don't need a developer resource if all you're doing is adding a new vocabulary. If you're adding terms to a vocabulary, that one you can actually roll out to authors. If you're adding fields that reference taxonomies to any of your content types or other entities, if you want to make simple field updates if you want to add fields to your taxonomy terms themselves, that's something that so many systems will not allow you to do. Simple example of like adding a flag to a list of countries. Piece of cake in Drupal. You could have had it done in the time I was talking about it. In other systems, nightmare, sometimes impossible. If you want to make simple updates to the display of term listing pages that you get for free out of the box with Drupal, that's just managed displays. And then if you want to make your taxonomies available to other entity types, as I said, that's just adding it as a field. Rolling back a little bit. So that's a consequence of taxonomies being entities. In Drupal, an entity is anything that's fieldable. I give that to you as a freebie as well, because that's always one of my interview questions when I'm talking to either site builders or developers. You'd be surprised how many people can't tell me what an entity is. But if you tell anybody who interviews you it's something you can attach a field to, you're in. So in one case, recently, we had this content inventory app that we had built because the system that they were migrating their content to, it was taking forever to stand it up, so we came up with this sort of intermediary system to track the process in Drupal to move to their other CMS. They should have just gone to Drupal. This particular company, they would classify or tag their content by country. They operate in, I think, 79 different countries. And they have 37 different languages that are applicable to different countries for a total set of combinations of like 195. But they don't tag their content by language. What it gets translated into is a function of which country it's tagged with. So America, we're tagged with US English. Belgium was tagged with UK English, French, and Netherlands Dutch. So this was simply a case of attaching a second taxonomy to my country vocabulary, and then I could generate all the different stuff I needed from it. Taxonomies can be used with Path Auto. Is everybody familiar with the Path Auto module? Okay, lots of nods. It allows you to, as you know, if you don't do anything to configure friendly URLs in Drupal, what you get is node/node ID. Personally, I'm still baffled why Drupal.org has never implemented Path Auto, because trying to remember node numbers is maddening. But you use tokens, and those tokens can be field values, including taxonomy references. So in this case, I had a news content type, and this is why I just configured for the purpose of the demo. A news content type that I had a topic vocabulary that I added to, and the topic had values like sports, local, leisure, etc. So if I wanted my notes to appear as leisure/new movies opening this weekend, all I had to do is tag it with that value, provide the title, and I was able to bulk generate all my URLs that would be then very SEO friendly. Okay. This is the second slide that I was showing the result of it. After I've added the pattern, then I bulk generate, and you can see what the results were. Obviously, I was using devel generate for the example. All right. I will make these slides available too, so have no fear. Taxonomy Manager makes it even better. Working with large taxonomies, this is actually that example I was telling you about. Working with large taxonomies in Drupal can be a little bit painful because the interface is you add a term, you add a term, you save it, add a term, you save it, add a term, you save it. That's fine if you've got like 5. If you've got 1,200, that's terrible. So I don't show the particular screen that allows you to do this, but you can, Taxonomy Manager, you can bulk import and export. You can, in a textual fashion that's kind of reminiscent of YAML, do one entry per line in a text box, and you can indent them if you want to indent your taxonomy. So this can suddenly become a simple one screen, enter, press return. You can view 2 different vocabularies at the same time. You can move terms from one vocabulary to another. Neat stuff. We talked about that already. Some things could still be better. So synonyms. I didn't even talk about synonyms at this point. In a real taxonomy, you have this problem that you and I may use different terms for the same concept. For instance, fizzy beverage that probably has some carbon, well, it's got carbonation, typically is dark colored, has a lot of sugar. Many different brands of this. What do you call that thing?
Soda.
I heard soda. What else do we have? Pop. Exactly. That's the right answer. I grew up in the western part of North Carolina, which is very close to Atlanta, where Coke is made, leading to conversations like this when I was a kid. You would walk into the store and you'd say, "I'd like a Coke," and they'd say, what kind? And you'd say, Sprite. You need, in some cases, the ability to define your preferred term and say, this is how we're going to talk about this thing, but you can't force anybody else to talk about it that way. I mean, you can train your people internally, but you have no control over your visitors. So synonyms allow you to say that these three things all really refer to this term, but I want to be able to roll it up to this preferred value. There is a module for that in 7 called Synonyms. In 8, that has not even started getting ported yet. So, if you're looking for something to do this weekend on Sprint Day, I'm sure they would appreciate the help. Secondly, browsing large hierarchical taxonomies. There's not a great tool for it. I don't really like any of the widgets for taxonomy, unless you're dealing with very small vocabularies. Because you can basically do an autocomplete, or you can do a drop-down list. I think you might be able to do checkboxes or radio buttons, but I'm not. Don't quote me on that one. There is taxonomy tree reference, I think it is, in 7 TTR, something like that. Is okay for trees, but again, no work on porting that to 8 yet. And I haven't seen anything where if you needed to provide your tagger with a little bit more contextual help, like some scope notes. Scope notes are just the nerdy taxonomist term for the notes to tell people how to categorize something, how you use this particular term. All that would be, sort of custom integrate your own widget if you needed to do that. So, when should I use different things? I mean, taxonomies, you don't want to go hog wild with them. There are places where they make sense and places where they don't. Sometimes the right thing to do is a plain old select list where you've hard-coded your options. The place to do that is when your options list is relatively static. It's going to change at most a couple of times a year, and it's not a problem to push out a config change in a feature or in configuration management now to provide the new values. And there's no need to ever look at an option by itself. What I mean by that is, if an option exists purely to describe something else, if it's just a data element and it doesn't make sense without the context of the thing it describes, use a select list. Don't do anything crazy. Term reference, this is kind of your standard way of exposing a taxonomy to people. Authors and visitors need to update the options. It's either open so that visitors can provide their own, or certain power authors, we want them to be able to edit the list values itself. That's a good place for term reference. If the terms need associated fields, like the example I used, if we had a list of countries and we wanted to put a flag icon associated with them, you really need to do something like term reference then. Or if there's a use case for viewing an individual term, like let's say we had a country page that just showed a larger version of the flag, the country name, maybe a brief synopsis of this is what you need to know about this country, and then a list of the countries that were tagged with that value. Great use for term reference. In an entity reference for other kinds of entities, could be a user, could be a node. This is better for the use case where that thing, that entity really has its own independent existence, and people care about it apart from how it's used anywhere else. So imagine we're building a site like IMDb, right? Internet Movie Database. You're going to have, if we were doing that in Drupal, we'd have a content type for films, and those films would need to refer to persons, actors, directors, etc., typically acting in particular roles. So you need the association between a movie type and a person type. And you probably need to have another field that goes along with that to say what this person did in the context of this particular film. But that's the case where you're making direct references between two nodes as opposed to doing anything with a taxonomy. Okay, questions. And be like this guy. Don't be like this guy. He's probably checking this file. I don't know what he's doing.
In the last
slide you showed about when to use taxonomies as opposed to select lists and stuff like that. A lot of times when I read a taxonomy, it's because I want to be able to use it in views. You know, like I might have blog posts that I want to have appear in different places depending on how they're tagged or something. So I've been using taxonomies just because that's the only way I really know how to make them work in views. Does that seem appropriate?
You should be able to filter by specific value of a list as well, of a static list.
So where would I be creating those values?
You mean where, so if you're trying to set up an individual page that would go to all my red things or whatever?
I guess, so when I create the content type for that, are you saying that instead of having a term reference, I would be using people would be choosing from a select list?
Yeah, you could do that.
On that same line, I created a vocabulary and a bunch of letters in it, and I used that as a selector for a field in my content. And so what exactly is stored in there? So I do a view on it, and do a contextual filter, to show the number, not the name.
Ah, you're right. And this actually came up, you were there for this, I can't remember her name, but there was a lady at our user group back in Durham who was talking about some multilingual challenges that she had that arose specifically from that use case. And I don't recall what her solution was. I've never ran into that specific issue before. Do you remember what it was? Okay. If you'll email me or hit me on Twitter, I will make an effort to get you a real answer to that, because it is answerable. It's just not coming to me.
Yeah, like I said, when I do the contextual filter in views, it just shows me the name and the number. Not
Right.
the name. I can't make a relationship to it or anything. It's just the number.
Yes.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about a project where you used taxonomy and it was really just gets you excited to think about how you used it, and tell us a story.
I don't know that it got me excited to use it. The things that we want to do, I think we're still very much, I find that in many cases we are more there than our clients are. Like, they get the concepts and they want to do it, but once you start getting down to the hard work of building the taxonomy and differentiating things, that's where things start to fall apart. But we do have one that is currently ongoing, not a Drupal project, where they want to offer targeted experiences to business customers, tailored experiences. They have a variety of differentiated offerings for specific industries. Shipping solutions for pharmaceutical, freight solutions for automotive manufacturers, reverse logistics for, let's say you're another kind of like a parts provider or something and you want to be able to handle returns, you don't want to do the returns, they will actually manage that whole warehouse chain for you themselves. So one of the things they want to do is a fairly straightforward thing is when you, the visitor, come there, as an anonymous visitor, they want to use data from DemandBase. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with them, but they do sort of the same thing that MaxMind does for IP address to geolocation. They do that for IP address to NAICS. So they will make their best guess, and in my opinion, it's about 70% effective from what I've seen, of going, oh, you're hitting me from this IP address, you must be in this industry. One of the big problems we run into is, like, if we all went to demandbase.com right now, you probably would find that thought we were an educational institution because we're at one, when in fact we probably do all kinds of different things. But it's better than assuming that I know nothing about it in most cases. Sometimes wrong, sometimes nothing is better than wrong, otherwise it's the other way around. But if we can ever get there to where we want to be, we should be able to, as soon as you show up, I should be able to show you, oh, new visitor, I've never seen her before. I don't know that she's a her right now. But I know that she's coming to me from an educational institution. Here are the solutions that we have that I want to put in front of her. Here are case studies that are relevant to education. Here are specific differentiated products that are relevant to education, and so on. You also then can start developing these rules. Actually, you reminded me of something else I was going to say. You can start developing rules around how those things map to users. But the hard part in my experience, is not classifying the content, because you've got a lot of control over that. The hard part is classifying the user in a way that's relevant to attaching to the content. It applies more than just content, though, because if you think about the same concept for dating sites, job sites, there's almost anything where you can connect any kind of entity, two persons to each other, person to content, content to content. You know, the other content like this scenario is pretty standard, right? So you can say, oh, you read this article, it's about dogs, kittens. I should have had a kitten slide. You might want to see more kitten slides. Here are those. And that raises two very good points. So the simplest way to think about categorization is in terms of simple keyword categorization. Does this keyword occur or not? That's really not all that interesting, because there are enough good ways to search by keyword that problem's pretty well solved. It gets more into situations where an article about Heisman Trophy candidates, for instance. I went and found one specifically to illustrate this and forgot to throw it up there. In a 3,000-word article about this year's Heisman Trophy candidates, the word sports was never mentioned at all, and yet it's fairly obviously something about sports. The word football was only mentioned 3 times, because by the time you get down to such specific content, you don't need to say that to the person who's reading it because they know it's about that. But to somebody who hasn't discovered that, there's no way to find that if you're just doing keyword searches. The other thing is rules-based content association it's tough for people to get. It's tough to construct meaningful rules, and it's only valuable if refining to the next level gives you enough of a better result that it justifies the cost. Like really, hypothetically, I could have given each one of you individually a personally tailored version of this presentation, where I would have talked with examples that were specific to you, and it would have taken me 1,000 hours to put that all together, and it would have taken 60 hours to have that conversation 60 times. You know, right now there's somebody in this room who's like, man, I wish I'd gone to a different session. And that's okay. I mean, I've had one of those at DrupalCon. But to get to the point where I don't lose anybody, it's probably cost prohibitive. The other thing, though, the way you get around that is when you can move away from the rules-based stuff to pure machine learning type situations. There you can deal with associations that you may not even be able to understand as somebody who's looking at the content. And this gets into, since we're at University of Minnesota, there's a guy named Joe Constant. He's over at the other campus. He does a course on recommender systems that I've tried to take twice, and work always gets busy about halfway through the course. But it's a great course. I'd recommend it to anybody that gets into those things like k-nearest neighbor functions and stuff like that. So I know that as a computer, I can say Chris and Rob are Chris's past purchases and Rob's past purchases are pretty similar. Here's some stuff that Rob has bought that Chris has not bought. I don't know why these guys are similar, but I'm going to guess that since Rob liked it and they sit here close to each other in the same n-dimensional space, they'll probably like the same things. There's all kinds of other things you have to adjust for in that model, though, like recency, because if you're like me and you get interested in the topic, you buy like 10 books on it, and you're like really into it for a while, and then like a year later, if you try to sell me stuff on the same thing, I'm like, I already read all the books about that. I'm smart. Any other questions? We've got like 3 or 4 more minutes. Okay. Okay. I'll ask you questions then. All right.
With facets, you mentioned facets. So, like the REI example, it's men's jackets, outdoor wear. But then you start getting into these other things like breathable, non-breathable, windproof, waterproof, where they're just behaviors. Is when certain things start to break down into behavior, is that when you start using facets, or when do you decide not to have a hierarchy?
No, that's actually great. You can have multiple hierarchies that are independent of each other, and that's why trying to come up with the one true navigational structure, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. And with REI, it's a great example. Men's and women's, that's a pretty easy easy choice to make. I mean, you're pretty much interested in one or the other unless you're buying for somebody who's not yourself. But you get into these situational uses, and there's where if I were planning a fishing trip and I owned no gear whatsoever, I'm purely sticking even at the clothing aspect here, I might buy a different kind of clothing for that than I would for mountaineering. There might be some pieces that overlap because they're applicable to both, but they're not. So I would prefer in that situation, I think, to have a multi-valued hierarchical taxonomy where I could select activities and say this article is good for all of these different kinds of activities. Then if I'm trying to assemble a guide to how you go fishing if you've never been, all the stuff you need to go buy or borrow from your buddy, but we're giving you the information, so come buy it. I would want to be able to dynamically pull in products that were related to what I talked about. And that was actually one of the specific use cases we had for the home improvement retailer. And the reason they were trying to classify things in terms of not only that room, but they had a 6-phase product life cycle that started with kind of ideation, which is, you may be months away from actually starting on the project, but you're like, I hate this kitchen, what would my ideal kitchen look like? All the way through to what they called enjoyment, which also kind of included maintenance. I've just got this brand new linoleum floor. How do I take care of my brand new linoleum floor? Linoleum's better than it used to be in the 70s, by the way.
I have a follow-up question. Have you ever seen anybody use that, which you mentioned, using it for views to play out different kind of content on different pages? Have you ever seen it to the flip side where you would kind of watch what people are browsing on your site and use SEO and use taxonomy and then to like store attributes about a person's behavior and what their interests might be?
That is one of our specific use cases that we want to tackle on that logistics project that I was telling you about. A lot of systems, Drupal does not have this that I've seen. Somebody may have built a module, but I haven't seen it, that will track click path. And then you can begin to attribute your user from that. It's a lot more common to see people trying to do that in their analytics data layer because it becomes easier to track across multiple properties that you own at that point and build out a really fully orbed perspective on who the user is, hopefully without being creepy.
To add to that, there's another thing that you, and actually a lot of other companies will do, is they won't just look at their own data. They'll scope through all of your cookies to figure out where you've been, what you've been looking for, even on their competitors, to narrow their taxonomy terms that they're actually giving to you.
Thank you for mentioning it. There is a site, you might know the name of this one, Chris. It's Blue something, like Blue Kind, something like that. I don't have the exact name. But they place a cookie on you, and then they will aggregate interaction across multiple sites, and then you as a site owner, can buy a subscription to their data, which then gives you a little bit of that. I can start to make a guess that I couldn't make for Rachel earlier if I was only geolocating her, if I was only getting her industry. I can probably make some guesses based on things that she's liked and stuff that she's bought, whether she's male or female and how old she might be and that kind of thing. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the place. All right, so I think we're going to call it then. And thank you all. What's that?
Party time.
Yeah. Well, no, we got